Become aware of a situation of violence. Violence happens this close. Out here, it's not dangerous, right? In this close, the head is a very dangerous weapon.
Yes, I do make my living out of fighting, and it's true that a large percentage of my opponents end up in the hospital because I'm good at what I do. I spent the past 25 years learning to do just that. And no, I don't see anything wrong in using karate for that purpose. To me, that's what the martial arts are for. Terry, the opening quote is indicative of the hardline approach expressed by interviewee Gary Spiers during our 4.5 hours of tape conversation. I met this big New Zealander in 1970 in Tokyo, where he was living at the time. Discovering that we had a lot in common, our mutual love of karate, and we both had been employed in the physical security field, we became friends. When he was ready to leave Japan, I encouraged him to come to England. This he did, settled in Liverpool, and he's been here ever since. We couldn't get rid of him. Only joking. We began training together, and he started teaching his style of karate, Goju Kai. During the first year of his stay, Gary tried to obtain work in his trade as a slaughterman, butcher, but due to the high unemployment situation in the area, he was unsuccessful and soon found himself back at his old job of what is commonly termed bouncing or minding on nightclub doors. That's what I was doing at the time, which left my days free for karate, and I had no difficulty at all in finding Gary security work in Liverpool, which was probably the largest percentage of nightclubs and discotheques of anywhere in Great Britain. He was tailor-made for the job actually, with his size, around 6 foot and 240 pounds. At that time, nowadays he's 280 pounds, plus that's 20 stone. His ability, along with lots of wrestling and judo, know-how, he'd left Japan with a 3rd degree black belt from Master Gojen Yamaguchi, the Cat, and his experience. He'd worked for years on night spots and working men's clubs in Australia. Gary. One of my earliest memories, it was my first ever pin-up, was a centre page from the Ring magazine. It was a close-up of Rocky Marciano's first splitting Jersey Joe Walcott's nose in half with a punch. I wanted to box at 7 years old, but my mother would not allow me to do this, so I started wrestling instead, and I really loved it. I loved it that much that since that time, I've always spent a large proportion of my waking hours in gymnasiums and dojos all over the world, learning and practicing combat. I remember my mother constantly giving me earache and criticising the fact that I spent so much of my time learning to fight. But then she didn't have my arguments at school, and she didn't have to defend herself to and from school or on the rugby field, where because of my large size, I found myself up against older, wiser people. My parents were warned several times to put me into something to take the aggression out of me before I got into serious trouble. Apparently, I was always in fights as a youngster, but you see, at the time, in the early 50s, New Zealand was inundated with European culture who brought over all their ethnic, religious and political bullshit with them. Their kids obviously reflected their attitudes, and in a school of say 1,000 pupils, a good 40% were immigrants. Now, through no fault of my own, I have Maori blood in me, of which I am in fact extremely proud. However, in that school, at that time, there were only about 7 of us with Maori heritage. As a consequence, because we were the smallest group, we got the most stick. The main fellow who taught me wrestling was a fairground fighter who used to nightly take on all comers. He'd also fill in for the boxer if he wasn't available. Sometimes they would take a hammering from an unknown challenger and be unable to put in an appearance. Now, he was so good, I did not realise just how good until later on, when I was exposed to other forms of training and trainers. I realised just how lucky I'd been to have him as my first teacher when I compared what he taught to the stuff that was being handed out under the heading of self-defence around the country and the wrestling that was being taught at schools and colleges. The collegiate wrestling that I watched being taught was nice, and by that I mean they had locker rooms and showers, a nice environment, and on the mat they did classical, dead correct wrestling moves, and they wouldn't have handled him, my teacher, for 1 minute because of his fighting know-how and super experience at taking on anybody and everybody who cared to climb through the ropes to face him. Once I started combative training, I never stopped. Wherever I would travel to find work, all over New Zealand and Australia, I would find a gym to work out in. The first thing I'd look for in a strange place was accommodation, and the next thing I'd find would be a gym, because I loved it. My friends would go to the pub after work, and I used to go to a gym. During my teens, I became interested in karate. I had heard about all these special blows and kicks that they did, and I eventually read E.J. Harrison's Manual of Karate. But at first, I started practicing judo. I was working at a big meatworks in New Zealand. That's what I am by trade, a butcher or slaughterman. And I met a chap from Auckland called Charlie Sterling. He was only a brown belt, but that was a high grade at the time, and I began training with him. Not only because I admired his judo, but I also liked the way in which he conducted his life. He was a thorough gentleman. It has been my experience that the more physically competent people, or the more confidence they have in their own personal lives, and the more gentlemanly this makes them. Because they don't have things to prove. The minimum of aggression is normally displayed by these type of people in their everyday lives. So I was learning to throw, trip, hold down, apply locks, strangles and chokes. I found it very interesting and easy to do because of my wrestling training. I also found it very effective because it taught you the ability to get hold of clothes, which everybody wears, and it's very practical to, say, choke people with their own jacket. This and other judo techniques I learned have a great usefulness outside the environment of the gym, and I particularly like that aspect of it. Terry, why the preoccupation with street effectiveness? Gary, well, I was working in a job where you had knives in your hands all day. I was living on a work camp where there was all kind of gambling, drinking, bringing women back to the camp on a day-to-day basis. I was a young fellow at the time, and that was what is regarded by contemporary society as a very hard lifestyle. The fact that in the canteen you were quite liable to lose your issue of food to some older, bigger and harder fellow, or if you had a nice motorbike parked outside, or a nice sports coat, and he wanted to borrow it, if you refused, you would be promptly bashed. A regular thing that used to happen to the younger fellas, the boy butchers, was that when they got paid, the older, harder ones would ask them for a loan, and it would never be repaid, no matter how many times you asked, unless you were willing to fight over it. And then if you took second place, you still wouldn't get your money back. So this creates a pressure. It's commonly called bullying. There was someone teaching karate in New Zealand at that time, but no one could tell me where it was at. It was all conducted in semi-secrecy and all that nonsense. I travelled to Australia for work, and it was in Brisbane that I first began formal karate training. I'd be around 19 years old at that time. There was a chap running a dojo. It was called Oaken One Shori style. His name was John Ryan, and I liked what I saw there. They didn't have the hand dexterity or the bobbing and weaving of boxers, nor the rough and tumble of wrestling, but I liked the kicks. I realised that if I could learn the kicking, it would augment the ability I already had at grappling. I also liked the aspect that they trained you to fight several people at once. So I trained there for a while until my work took me away from Brisbane. I trained at various other dojos, including one called the Silvertop Karate Club. Silvertop was the name of a big taxi firm, and they had specifically brought over two really good Korean Taekwondo instructors. They called their style Mudo Kwan, as I recall. Mr. Kim was the name of one of them, and I'm not sure of the other one, but he was also a sixth dan at judo, or judo, as the Koreans call it. Anyway, Silvertop had engaged them because two taxi drivers working for the company had been murdered, had their throats cut in robberies. So these Koreans were brought out for the specific purpose of training the company's employees to defend their bloody souls. One of the founding members of the club was Jack Rosinski, who is a well-known figure in the martial arts scene today in Australia. Another teacher I trained under was Mr. Kato, who is one of Masutatsu Oyama's good Kyokushin Kai people, a very fast, hard karate man. I like that training, the Kyokushin Kai. In Australia, they got really good by fighting each other all the time, and they kicked the groin immediately. Other systems didn't concentrate on that kind of thing. Now, karate was becoming more and more popular, and lots of schools were opening up, but I wasn't too impressed by a lot of what I saw. I used to go all over the place to train. Sometimes I'd pay a whole year's affiliation just for a handful of lessons before my work would force me to move on. And I would find that, in many instances, I'd go to train or watch a karate class, and I would not reckon much to the teacher's chances against me in a real fight. Terry, surely that wouldn't stop you training, wondering? Yes, of course it did. I only wanted to be taught by people who looked more proficient in combat than I was. See, I'm a big person. I come from a large race of people, and I've always thought a good combat teacher should have the capacity to put someone of my size out of the game. I never thought I could have copped for beaten in a fight, either of the Koreans nor the Japanese Kato, and that's why I stayed with them for as long as I could. In some of the karate clubs that I attended, we were given thousands of push-ups to do. That was not what I wanted. I joined one karate club, the first Goju training I ever did, and although the instructor, Tino Seberano, was excellent himself and taught me real good ways of using groin kicks and joint kicks, etc., he constantly stressed all the time that we must not touch at all in the sparring, and that I could not understand nor agree with. Another policy that many of these people had was to take you for a run. Well, if I wanted to run, I'd have continued playing rugby. Running has a lot to do with stamina if you intend fighting a number of 3-minute rounds. But my object has always been, because the situations I find myself in have always demanded it, to finish off my opponents as quick as possible, before they can get support from other people. So it used to actually annoy me to pay a training fee to learn karate, go along to a dojo, and be taught how to run. I thought this was wrong. Terry, well, I can't agree with your sentiment that any karate instructor that you felt you could best in the street had nothing to teach you. Gary, well, okay, I didn't mean what I previously said as a blanket ruling. It's just that I was that interested in learning good techniques that I went to every conceivable place that I could go. In a lot of karate schools that I went, they only kicked and punched the air. You had no way of knowing how strong your blows were. They deliberately barred any form of contact whatsoever. And if I thought that they didn't have some proficiency at hurting me, I used to get frustrated and leave. It used to really frustrate me, marching up in line, just hitting the air. I like to hit things and people, and I never minded being hit back if I had dropped my guard or made a mistake. Because to me, that's what it's all about. The avoidance of pain and the retaliatory dishing out of pain. I like the Okinawan system of training when I got to Okinawa, because they utilise a lot of striking pads and other equipment in their training. I like the Taekwondo because they used to put you in half armour and you immediately learn how to hit each other. You would start out slowly, just touching, and then build the speed up as you got more used to it. A lot of the jiu-jitsu type systems being taught at that time were strong contact systems. You had to work to get the lock on your opponent. You had to work to get any strangles or chokes on him. I've been to lots and lots of different schools in my time and sparred with them whenever possible. I've even tried some French savate, where the guys were incredibly supple, as in the ballet, but really all I had to do was to charge in and I'd have them all on the floor. What you have to understand is that I was living a totally different lifestyle to the average citizen, who simply does not put his physical well-being on the line for the sake of a job. I was travelling around the country on my own, with one bag full of my working tools, another bag full of clothes, and my sole finance in my back pocket. Everywhere I went with an alien accent was dangerous. When I turned up at an ironworks that I had travelled hundreds of miles to, and 12 Maltese guys blocked me at the gate, told me there was no work there, and I wanted to see the manager or foreman and have him tell me there was no work there, I needed to be able to fight, and fight well, I'll tell you. Another thing was that by then, I'd started to do some security work in pubs or clubs. Whenever I went to a town and got a day job, I'd see if there's any work to do looking after places at night, and I'd take that as well, so that I could bank one set of wages. In that way, I had a higher standard of life and could afford more things than people who had just one job. Terry, exactly when did you first start using your martial arts to flatten people in clubs? Gary, what? That's a bit strong, isn't it? Perhaps, let me rephrase the question. When did you first start moderating people's behaviour in clubs? Gary, that would have been about 1963 to 64. I started with Bob Jones, who today has a large security firm and a big karate organisation in Australia. Also a chap called Bill Bowling. I was in a dojo there with these two, and I was asked to help out in a situation that had occurred. A group of dance halls in Melbourne had an outbreak of severe trouble, and we were able to put an end to that problem. Terry, before we get too deeply into the incidents you have been involved in over here, could we backtrack a little and talk about some of the battles you had in Australia? I know some of them were quite severe.